Have you ever heard the term playing possum? It's when a possum plays dead to get a predator to leave it alone. Ukraine has done something similar in the Donetsk city of Siversk, only with a twist. The possum didn't run away after playing dead. It bore its fangs, and now it's taking massive bites out of the Russian military. Russia thought it had won in Siversk, but Ukraine has turned it into an inescapable trap that has forced Putin's troops to descend into a nightmare. December 23rd saw the BBC report that Ukraine had confirmed the withdrawal of its soldiers from the frontline city of Siversk, even releasing a statement saying it had made the decision to preserve the lives of our soldiers and the combat capability of units in the face of Russia's forces having a significant advantage in manpower. As we later found out, this step was the setting of a trap that has now been sprung. But Russia didn't know it at the time. It had spent 3.5 years battering the small city, which lies ahead of the fortress belt of fortified cities that must be toppled if Vladimir Putin is to claim Donetsk and then the Donbass with everything that it had. Soldier after soldier was sent to be ground up by Ukraine's defenses. By October, the Russian 3rd Combined Arms Army that had been tasked with taking the city had suffered 13,055 casualties just a few months after they took Donetsk. Ukraine had turned Siversk into a meat grinder, but it was a grinder that was starting to clog due to the sheer volume of meat that Putin had fed into it. But finally, Russia had won. The prey had fallen to the predator, and that predator got its chance to bask in the sun and fill its belly before it would move on to the next victim. Only that's not what happened. Despite so much damage having been done to Siversk, the city was far from being done in terms of being an asset to Ukraine's military. The defenders stationed there had already churned through thousands of Putin's forces, and while the remaining Russians toasted their victory, they had no idea that they had done exactly what Ukraine wanted them to do. Siversk was no longer a city Ukraine needed to defend. It had been turned into a trap that would cause more death to Putin's forces than ever before. Ukraine has been using a new tactic that enabled what it was doing in Siversk right now, so keep watching to find out what that is. Before that, let's take a look at what is now happening in Siversk. In a report on what Ukraine has transformed the city into, News Sky says that the Russian victory in Siversk was no victory at all. It had become a poisoned chalice for the Russian soldiers unfortunate enough to be sent there, as Ukraine has transformed the city into a silent trap from which there is no escape. Here's how the trap works. Siversk lies in the direction of the Slavic territories, somewhere between the Ukrainian settlements of Liman and Lysychansk. It's also right on the line that leads toward the major Donetsk fortress belt cities of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, both of which Putin's forces will need to topple if they are to take the oblast and, by extension, the Donbass region. Siversk also provides plenty of tactical advantages for any force that holds it. The city is elevated, meaning occupying forces get a springboard from which to launch their attacks. It's also something of a logistical hub, as it facilitates crossings over the Siversky Donetsk River, and it's close to several transport arteries that Russia would love to control. You're probably wondering how this city could possibly be turned into a trap for Russia's forces. On the surface, Siversk should be the perfect sort of settlement for Russia to capture in its Donetsk campaign. But what Russia failed to realize is that sending its troops into such an elevated position is a double-edged sword. Yes, that sort of position is ideal for launching attacks and gaining a view over the rest of the battlefield. The catch is that elevation is only useful, at least in the case of Siversk, if the occupiers have the flanks under control. Guess what Russia doesn't have? Without sufficient control over the flanks around Siversk, Russia is sending troops into an elevated kill zone that puts them right in the path of Ukrainian forces that will have their sights squarely set on Siversk. Ukraine understood Siversk's potential vulnerabilities long before it withdrew its forces from the settlement, and there were already a few hints that the city was being set up for something major. Take the fact that Ukraine didn't build the sorts of defenses in Siversk that it normally would under its last city strategy as an example. In other major settlements that Ukraine has lost to Russia, such as Mariinka and Avdiivka, the city itself was seen as a standalone bastion of defense. Ukraine would fight almost to the last and only withdraw when the situation grew so dire that the only alternative left for its soldiers was certain death. The withdrawing troops would then move on to the next settlement, fortify, and continue the fight after Russia advanced. Siversk was different, as News Sky explains. Instead, Siversk was seen as part of a larger front. If the enemy pushed too far into this area without a well-protected rear and flank, they could be covered with artillery, drones, and strikes on supply routes, the outlet reports. Protection is precisely what Russia's forces lacked as they made their way into Siversk. The reason for this lack of protection comes down to the brilliant defense Ukraine mounted for Siversk. Russia battered the city for years, losing countless soldiers in the process. By the time that all of this attritional pressure paid off for Putin's forces, they were exhausted. Communications had been stretched as entire units were lost, and Ukraine continued to target command nodes. The infantry that eventually entered Siversk was less a conquering force and more the exhausted remnants of a much larger force that once was. Russia has also shot itself in the foot by destroying Siversk to the extent that it has. As the BBC pointed out in its report, Siversk is barely a recognizable city anymore. The infrastructure that once existed had been obliterated by Russian artillery and aerial strikes, and Russia made the fatal mistake of not attempting to take the surrounding regions, which are also elevated, and which Ukraine still controls. As Russia's assault groups entered Siversk, they walked right into an exposed hit zone, News Sky says. Ukraine made that zone count from almost the moment that Siversk fell. Combine the geography that we've already talked about with fire control, and you get the makings of Ukraine's trap. News Sky says that Siversk is structured such that all of the approaches to it, particularly in terms of the supply routes Russia is now using, fall right within the range of Ukraine's artillery and drone units. Both are now able to sit back on the elevated flanks that Russia hasn't captured and fire on Siversk at will. The predator has become the prey, as the very tactics that Russia used to capture Siversk have been turned against it. Things don't get better for Russia as its forces progress further into the city either. The deeper they go, the wider the target Ukraine can hit becomes. The Russian rear gets exposed, allowing Ukraine to score 2-for-1 hits on an almost daily basis. Russia, of course, isn't helping itself. Its current tactics boil down to sending assault troops in the direction of a target, with those groups then being followed up by armor support. The problem with this approach is that it relies on the assault groups, which are often on foot, to make progress. That can't happen in Siversk right now due to Ukraine's drones and artillery units. All that Russia's assault forces are doing, News Sky reports, is stepping onto a conveyor belt that takes them directly into oblivion. And the armor can't move forward at all. Russia's tank and vehicle operators know all too well what Ukraine's drones will do to them the moment they come into range. Even as far back as April 2024, about 65% of the tanks that Russia was losing were being destroyed by drones. There's simply no way for Russia to offer support to its assault troops in Siversk until it deals with the issues on the city's flanks, and it was too short-sighted to solve the problem before the city fell. None of this is speculation either. Though Ukraine is keeping quiet about the masterstroke it has pulled off in Siversk, open-source intelligence projects have revealed all. Russia is now stuck in a cycle of systematic strikes against its warehouses, bases, and logistical hubs, with some of those strikes logically being tied to its attempts to retain Siversk now that it has captured the city. Ukrainian drone footage captured on the roads and industrial zones in the city is also revealing that Russia's assault troops are being hit with kamikaze attacks wherever they try to go, News Sky reports. These types of battlefield tactics are exactly what we cover at the Military Show. You get much more than the headlines with us, as we report on what's really happening in Ukraine. Hit subscribe to stay ahead of the curve so you can find out more about things like what we're about to tell you. What we see now in Siversk is no surprise, at least not to those who are paying attention. It all comes back to something that we mentioned earlier in the video about a new strategy that Ukraine has concocted that is allowing it to destroy Russian soldiers even when Putin's army believes that it's achieved a victory. Forbes reported on this new strategy on January 16th, and the key behind it all is the type of tactical withdrawal that occurred in Siversk back in December. According to Forbes analyst Vikram Mittal, Ukraine is using a combination of defensive tactics to attrit Russia's military. The first of these tactics relates to what we've seen in and around Siversk for over 3 years. Ukraine builds defenses, anti-tank ditches, concrete bunkers, minefields, and huge walls of drones are located all around the settlements that Russia wants to assault. Now being referred to as kill zones, these layered defenses are designed to destroy as many would-be occupiers as possible before they even get a chance to launch assaults against cities like Siversk. The only disadvantage of these defenses is that they are finite. As long as Putin has enough soldiers to throw at them, they inevitably break down. Right now, Russia tends to favor using assault groups numbering between 50 and 60 soldiers, Mittal wrote on January 16th. When infantry from those groups finally breaks through Ukraine's defenses, they're exhausted but also expected to fight to the death with the units that Ukraine stations behind its kill zone. But it's here where Ukraine flips the script. When these assaults are launched against a Ukrainian position, Ukrainian forces withdraw immediately, temporarily ceding the ground. After pulling back, Ukrainian units conduct a series of drone, mortar, and artillery strikes against their former position, inflicting heavy casualties on the Russian forces now occupying it, Mittal writes. That's precisely what is happening in Siversk right now. Ideally, these traps will result in the straggling remains of the forces that have taken a settlement being forced into withdrawing. Ukraine's troops then move back in, reclaiming the territory that they had ceded. That's what we've seen in the Kyiv city of Kupiansk, where Ukraine has gone from being on the brink of losing the settlement to controlling 90% of it. It's unclear if Ukraine will have an opportunity to reclaim Siversk due to the trap that it's created. But even if Ukraine doesn't liberate the city, it will be able to spend the next few weeks, perhaps even months, destroying all of the occupying forces that try to move through it. If Plan A fails, Plan B is to force as much attrition as possible, ensuring that Russia pays a heavy price in blood and metal for every single gain that it makes. That price is going to matter if and when Russia is able to push on from Siversk. We'll explain why soon. But if attrition is what Ukraine aims for, it's been doing a great job of ensuring that Russia gets very little in return for the enormous numbers of soldiers and equipment it's sent to Ukraine. As Politico reported in October, Russia's military has been bleeding soldiers for very minimal gains. During the first 8 months of 2025, Russia lost 281,550 of its soldiers, the outlet reported, with over 86,700 of those soldiers being killed in action. The payoff was barely existent, as the Ukrainian Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief Alexander Sirsky said at the time. As for the general situation on the front, it remains difficult. The enemy continues to advance on the main directions, in particular Pokrovsk and Dobropilya directions. In other directions, the situation is characterized by low-intensity combat operations. In general, the situation is under our control, Sirsky claimed. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, loosely agreed with this assessment a few months later, as it pointed out that Russia had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers in 2025 to gain less than 1% of Ukraine. Siversk would have been among those so-called gains, and we know that the city is far from a safe haven for Russia's occupying forces. And things are only going to get worse for Putin. On January 21st, the Kyiv Post reported that Ukraine's new defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, had set Ukraine's forces a target of killing 50,000 Russian soldiers per month in 2026. The reason why? To make the price of war for Russia such that it will not be able to bear it, and thereby force peace by force, Fedorov said. That's the point of the Siversk trap, and others like it. Either Ukraine gets to storm back in and reclaim what it's lost, or it causes so much damage to the Russian military that it takes longer than the Kremlin anticipated to advance elsewhere. That brings us back nicely to Kramatorsk. While Siversk would normally represent a good capture for Russia due to the strategic reasons we mentioned earlier, the main reason why Putin wants that city is that it takes him a step closer to being able to launch assaults on Kramatorsk. As News Sky points out, the Siversk trap is causing Russia to lose the pace of the offensive that it wants to launch on the Kramatorsk-Konstantinivka agglomeration. That sort of slowdown is unacceptable to Putin. At the beginning of 2026, the news broke that he had set a deadline of April for the seizure of the entire Donetsk region. That deadline is fanciful at best and outright absurd in reality, when Russia still has to capture cities like Kramatorsk before Donetsk will fall. This is posture ahead of practicality by Putin. He wants to make Russia appear like a dominating force even as its soldiers are being blown to bits by Ukraine's artillery and drones in places like Siversk. He's setting these kinds of deadlines because he hopes that getting involved in peace negotiations, particularly the US, will believe that April is a realistic target. And if certain people believe the target, they will be more inclined to place pressure on Ukraine to cede Donetsk to Russia. Putin needs that capitulation to happen because he knows that Russia can't keep doing what he's doing in Donetsk for much longer. Back in November, the New Voice of Ukraine reported on an ISW assessment that said the pace of Russia's gains in Donetsk was so slow that it would take years, not a handful of months, for Russia to stand a chance of taking the entire oblast. By that time, Russia was on the brink of taking Siversk and held 66% of another frontline city, Pokrovsk. Fast forward to today, and Pokrovsk still hasn't fallen, and the soldiers attempting to push through Siversk and toward Kramatorsk are being destroyed. Years sounds more accurate than months, and that means that Putin's Donetsk deception has already fallen apart. All of that is without even mentioning that taking Kramatorsk will be a far larger task than the taking of Pokrovsk and Siversk ever was. Kramatorsk, along with Sloviansk, is part of the Donetsk fortress belt. Both of these cities had pre-war populations of around 200,000 people, which is a good indicator of their size. For context, Pokrovsk had a pre-war population of 60,000, and Siversk had around 10,000 residents. These are small cities in comparison to Kramatorsk, and it's taken Russia several years to capture them, or in the case of Pokrovsk, act like it has captured the city while fighting still rages. Donetsk isn't going to fall in 2026. That much seems clear. Kramatorsk will remain a major barrier, even though Russia is launching assaults in the direction of the city. As Army Inform reports, Russia is sending assault groups often numbering between 8 and 10 soldiers, though sometimes as few as 2 or 3, to infiltrate the city. These soldiers aren't lasting long. If Ukraine maintains its Siversk trap, any plans Russia might have had to use that city as a launching pad for more Kramatorsk assaults goes out of the window. Siversk is a nightmare for Russia right now, and it'll stay that way until Russia is able to shore up its vulnerabilities in its rear and on the city's flanks. As Russia's Donetsk assaults falter and its soldiers die in droves in Siversk, Ukraine has developed a brand new approach to war for 2026. The Ministry of Defense has been shaken up, a new kill target has been set, and Ukraine is set to modernize in ways that will guarantee even more Russian losses. Find out more about all of that in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more updates on what's really happening in the fight for Donetsk. And thank you, as always, for watching.